Greetings from the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law, and the United States. My name is Mark Graber, and I'm here to talk very briefly about recent developments in American constitutionalism. The most interesting development is a change in the way we talk to the rest of the world. Had this been about 15 years ago, I would have said there is some wonderful development that everyone ought to imitate, because we all knew not only was the United States a constitutional democracy, but constitutional democracy was whatever the United States was doing. And so if people in New Zealand or elsewhere weren't doing what the United States was doing, you were less a constitutional democracy. So if I was to talk about the First Amendment, free speech, I would be explaining why the American law of free speech is the best. If I would be talking about judicial review, I would say our court powers, both their powers and limits, are better, and they're a constitutional democracy. What struck me as the most interesting development over the last 3 to 5 years is Americans, particularly American officials, no longer talk like that. Rather, we don't really care what you are doing. We no longer think what we are doing constitutionally is of interest to the world. We're not attempting to export American ideas. We no longer think, first, we have a goal of making more countries constitutional democracies because constitutional democracy is good, or even we have a goal of making more countries constitutional democracies because constitutional democracies are our natural allies. Let me very briefly, trying desperately not to go over my 5-minute courtesy limit, explain 3 manifestations of this. The most obvious is President Trump and his administration, that this is the first administration that makes no effort to celebrate American constitutional democracy abroad. We have no policy that any nation ought to be a constitutional democracy. If anything, President Trump is more inclined to cozy up with Putin, with Orban, with people threatening constitutional democracy. He doesn't have much good to say about the leaders of more vibrant constitutional democracy. When President Trump speaks about the United States, he says the Constitution of the United States has no universalistic mission or ideas. It's a Constitution that is good for the United States. It is good for us. Whether it's good for you is simply your affair. A second feature of this is constitutional interpretation in the United States. Increasingly, the dominant mode of interpretation is called originalism. Now, whether originalism as practiced in the United States has anything to do with what people thought when they ratified the Constitution is questionable. So, for example, it's fairly well known that the framers sought to relieve the influence of money on politics. Originalists claim we can't limit campaign spending. But the most interesting thing about originalism from a comparative perspective is originalism presumes nothing in the Constitution is universalistic. That means 2 things. First, when we discuss the meaning of free speech, we go back to a particular American history. We don't ask ourselves, what is free speech? What is equal protection? What is religious freedom? But rather we ask what people who wore hideous wigs thought was freedom of speech. That means, second, we don't really care what you think about freedom of speech. Our ideas are distinctly American. Because freedom of speech is not universalistic, what England does, what New Zealand does, what Australia does, is of no interest to American constitutional interpretation. We see this with respect to impeachment, which is the hot issue in the United States, or was. Both liberals and conservatives, supporters of President Trump and opponents, fought over what did the framers mean by high crimes and misdemeanors in 1787. Nobody asked whether, in fact, President Trump was fit to hold office, what an impeachment procedure should be, how impeachment ought to work in the 21st century. Certainly nobody asked what other countries do for impeachment as a lesson for the United States. Nobody said we were teaching other countries a lesson. Rather, impeachment debate was simply over distinctive features of the United States Constitution. We weren't trying to teach you a lesson. We weren't trying to learn from you. The last feature of American exceptionalism and withdrawal from the world may be President Trump's use of the Declaration of Independence. As most of you may know, it's one of the things everybody knows about the United States is when we became a nation, we declared to the world, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, these seem to be fairly universalistic ideas, a message indeed Thomas Jefferson wanted to send to the world. Jefferson didn't think these are distinctly American ideas, that we simply meant we believe this, as in we're the people who cheer for the American Olympic team. We believed all reasonable people ought to believe in these ideals, that they ought to be exported. And one feature of every 20th and 21st century president before Donald Trump was their program. Whether it was a liberal program, a conservative program, a libertarian program, an almost socialist program, but they claimed to derive their program from the universalistic ideals of the Declaration, that presidents mentioned the Declaration constantly in their speeches. Trump is new about this. One of the remarkable things about Trump is if you listen to his speeches, he never mentions the Declaration. If you listen to his program, it is not rooted in the Declaration. Rather, his program is simply rooted in an idea, making America great again, which means military force, which may mean economic, but making America great no longer in Donald Trump's mind means making America committed to the values of the Declaration. Indeed, a feature of Trump is, outside of appointing judges, he rarely refers to the Constitution, that it's not simply that we want to, or no longer want, to export our constitutional ideals abroad. They no longer seem very interesting to Mr. Trump at home. Well, that's my 5 minutes of fame, said as quickly as I could. Thank you very much.